Hey guys, what's going on? I'm Eric from Think Easy. Today we're going to be dealing with Mark 16, 9 through 20, often referred to as the longer ending of Mark. I'm going to give you my reasons for why this passage is not original and therefore should not be considered scripture. And like last time, we're going to break up our evidences into external and internal evidence. And if you haven't seen my previous videos, I would highly recommend going and watching those first because I lay a lot of groundwork, and if you're not familiar with this field, then it will make this video a little difficult to comprehend. So please go and watch those videos first. Okay, external evidence number one is that this passage is absent from two of the oldest and most reliable manuscripts, as well as the Old Latin Codex, as well as the Sinaitic Syriac manuscript, about 100 Armenian manuscripts, as well as the two oldest Gregorian manuscripts. Now admittedly, this is not a strong argument, and I'll just be honest at that point. It's only absent from two Greek manuscripts and possibly one more. The majority of the Greek manuscripts do contain this passage, and so we just have to be honest at that point and get that out on the table. But however, it is absent from a lot of other manuscripts from different languages, and that should at least be considered in this conversation. Reason number two is that early Christian writers such as Clement of Alexandria and Origen show no knowledge of the passage. Furthermore, Eusebius and Jerome also say that this passage was absent from almost all Greek manuscripts known to them. Reason number three is that the manuscripts that do contain this passage also contain either asterisks or obeli. And we've talked about this in the past, is that these were critical marks that the scribes would use to indicate that the passage or verses were suspicious, or that they believed the passage or verses were not original. Reason number four, the multiple endings of Mark. Now this is the part of the argument that is really strong for me, is that the manuscript tradition contains not only the traditional ending of Mark, but also contains alternate endings. Well, not necessarily alternate endings, but different endings. 4 to be exact. Okay, now this part can get a little confusing, so make sure that you pay close attention to this part of the video. In the manuscript tradition, there exist 4 different endings of Mark. The first ending is the traditional ending, or the ending that is found in most, if not all, English translations available today. This ending is attested to by the majority of Greek manuscripts. The second ending ends at verse 8, but then has one extra verse, which reads, "But they reported briefly to Peter and those with him all that they had been told, and after these things Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamations of eternal salvation." The third ending is the same ending as ending 2 with the extra verse after verse 8, but then verse 9 through 20 follow after that. The fourth ending is the traditional ending with an extra passage in between verses 14 and 15 preserved by manuscript Washingtonianus. And that passage reads, "And they excused themselves, saying, This age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over the unclean things of the spirits, or does not allow what lies under the unclean spirits to understand the truth and power of God. Therefore reveal yourselves now." Thus they spoke to Christ, and Christ replied to them, "The term of the years of Satan's power has been fulfilled, but the other terrible things that draw near, and for those who have sinned I was handed over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, in order that they may inherit the spiritual and incorruptible glory of the righteousness that is in heaven." The fact that there are multiple endings within the manuscript tradition indicates strongly to me that this passage was not original. Still, some may argue that because this manuscript was in the majority of manuscripts, that should be included as scripture. The problem with that is that it does not explain away the multiple endings, and it does not explain away the asterisks or obeli. And it also doesn't explain away the internal evidence that we're going to get into now. Now moving on to the internal evidence. Reason number one is that the vocabulary and style of writing in these verses are non-Markan. And we've talked about this before, that the vocabulary uses and the style of writing in this passage would indicate that Mark did not write it. In Mark's ending, there exist multiple words that Mark never uses anywhere else in his gospel. There are also words that are likewise never used anywhere else in the New Testament. Reason number two is that the connection between verse 8 and verse 9 is extremely awkward grammatically. In verse 8, the women are considered to be the subject, and in verse 9, Jesus is presumed to be the subject. This and a few other grammatical issues lead Bruce Metzger to say this: in short, all these features indicate that the section was added by someone who knew a form of mark that ended abruptly with verse 8 and who wished to supply a more appropriate conclusion. Reason number 3, the content of the passage. Now this is where it's going to get a little controversial, and so let us slow down a little bit and really explain what we mean by this. Dr. James White, in his book The King James Only Controversy, says this about the passage's content. We do not, by pointing out the following items, wish to indicate that an orthodox interpretation of these endings is not possible. Many conservative scholars have provided such interpretations, and we can stand by their work. Utilizing the principle of examining other passages that would help us understand or interpret these rather obscure verses does indeed yield a consistent viewpoint. However, the natural reading of these verses strongly suggests that the person who wrote them was not familiar with the entire Gospel of Mark itself and was utilizing apocryphal and unorthodox sources. The first issue is when Jesus is said to appear in a different form. Now, to be fair, this could be a reference to Jesus supernaturally keeping his disciples from recognizing him, like he did in Luke 24. However, the particular phrase that is used is unusual. It seems to indicate that Jesus could just change his form at will. Extreme care is taken by the other gospel writers to ensure that the readers knew that he rose physically from the dead. The second issue comes up in verse 14 when he's reclining at table with his disciples. Well, first of all, there's a numerical error. It says the 11, but Thomas is supposed to be absent. But secondly, it says that Jesus reproached them for their hardness of heart and unbelief. This is inconsistent of the other accounts of him dealing with his disciples. The next issue is in verse 16 with the conjunction of baptism and belief. This is unusual, and in no other place does Jesus conjoin these two like this. Next, in verses 17 and 18, the signs that are given to all believers, such as picking up snakes and drinking poison. This seems to indicate that these signs were to be given to all believers. And certainly in one case this happened to Paul. However, in that situation there could have been a very specific reason for that, such as God's sovereignty over the creation. There could have also been natural explanations for this, such as snakes not releasing venom when they bite, which is a common occurrence. These promises do not remove Christians from the natural consequences of life. Also, these verses are similar to many apocryphal writings that were circulating at the close of the New Testament. So there you go, those are the reasons why I believe that Mark is not original and therefore should not be considered scripture. Still, some would agree that although they believe Mark 16:9-20 are not original, that Mark didn't write them, that they should still be considered scripture and included in the Bible because of the widespread acceptance of these verses. However, that does not explain away the multiple endings, why they exist. It doesn't explain the existence of the OBELI and the asterisks. It doesn't explain away the content discrepancies. And so this leaves speculation on both sides. So really, who has the better arguments? Also still, some will compare this verse to the ending of Deuteronomy, where it's talking about the death of Moses and the burial of Moses. Well, Moses obviously didn't write that, somebody else did, but we still consider it scripture. The issue with that is that there are not multiple endings of the end of Deuteronomy. There are no asterisks or obeli. There's no content discrepancies. There's nothing like what we have in Mark 16. So although these verses are similar, they're really not. They're very different. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that it was helpful and beneficial. Please put in the comments below what you agreed with, maybe what you didn't agree with, and any objections that you might have. And until next time, I'm Eric from Think Easy.